So in all the panels I've been on, this is the first one where everybody seated here worked for an enterprise company. So as an old guy, you can tell I got a little bit of the gray beard here. The median age of the people that I see and work with is like 26, and they're all fresh out of school. They graduated college, before my daughter was born, or just after when my daughter was born. So I'm very happy to be with people that have some experience in the world. And the first thing I want to say is, Andrea, to my left, how do you go from running a $700 million P&L at Dell to blockchain?
Well, that's actually interesting, and I like the fact that you just called us old. That was good, because the fact that he called us old means that we've done a lot of things in our careers. You look really young. But during the last financial crisis, 2008, I had done an MBA, I had worked on Wall Street, and I had worked at Dell. And when I was working at Dell, and before that, I always knew that I wanted to work with startups. But 2008 sort of made it the perfect time to do that, because Dell was doing voluntary leaves, and so I got paid to go away, which is an amazing opportunity if you ever get that. And as a result of that, my husband's company had just been sold, and he started Lontra Ventures. And I said, well, if you're starting that, I'm coming with you. And from there, when Techstars came to Austin, I started investing. And really, if you look at the portfolio that he and I have built over the years, it really sort of follows many of the trends of Austin. So we have enterprise software, we have digital health, we have Bitcoin and /crypto, we have developer tools. And so, am I spread thin? Yes. Am I loving participating in so many Austin things? Yes. It's just this is an amazing city and an amazing time to be here with all of the innovation across so many different industries.
Well, we're glad to have you. And Ted, when I saw your profile, so for those that haven't read it, he's got his description in LinkedIn. It starts with attorney, SaaS investor, advisor, the typical stuff. Then you keep reading, it's genetics, psychedelics. You've got just this whole breadth and blockchain, of course, is on there. And I want to just for you to talk a little bit about that journey and what that looked like, and how you arrived into the blockchain world.
Sure. So, I started my career professionally, I guess, working in the U.S. Senate. I had a bit of a military background. I was doing foreign policy and defense kind of work for a member of the Senate. And then just became, really jaded. Like, once you see how the sausage gets made and the sort of inner workings of politics, is like, this isn't really my thing anymore. Went to law school, became a securities lawyer at the SEC, was kind of one of the early people involved in the digital currency working group there. And ultimately was just really ill-suited to sitting in a room by myself all day with like giant stacks of paperwork up to the ceiling, and never really talking to any other humans, but most importantly, just not using any of my superpowers on a day-to-day basis. So left there, kind of kicked off the entrepreneurial journey. And in parallel with that, I was doing SaaS kind of stuff, discovered Bitcoin in early 2013, and my now business partner was running the DC Bitcoin meetup. And so the sort of, back then we just called it Bitcoin and then crypto and then Web3, and it seems there's new names every few years for it, but it was kind of a parallel track to all the things I was doing, but really kind of getting to the core of what you're asking about. I was this technology investor, and after having sold the company, I was spending a lot of time like investing and advising. And a lot of what I realized kind of having this front row seat to tech was that working on the technology itself was really only half of the equation. The most important tech that I found I think we can actually be working on is the human OS, our own minds and our own hearts. And I found that the psychedelic movement and the health and longevity movement were just a great parallel to the technology that we were building. Like what we choose to prioritize and what we choose to build is just a reflection of our values. And I think a lot of people had these sort of perverse values and felt really disconnected from each other and lacked empathy and felt really disconnected from nature. And I just found that psychedelics were a really good tool for unlocking some of these things in people. And so we just decided that in parallel to working on the tech, we were going to work on the humans as well.
Speaking of the Speaking of the culture, do you notice a difference in the entrepreneurs from Austin, say, to DC or Silicon Valley, where I'm from? No, it's a cultural thing, but I'm just curious. Do you see a theme?
I mean, both of those places have far fewer cowboy boots and pocket knives. So that's, I think, a pretty easy and obvious one. But, like in Washington, D.C. and in San Francisco, both, you definitely have this culture of virtue signaling, which is really important. You have this culture of name dropping and of status and wanting to be seen as high status. I mean, in both of those places, like, what do you do is the first question that you are always asked, right? I have a friend in Austin who's a fellow crypto VC. I worked out with him at the gym for 5 months before knowing what this guy did at all. So I think that's a big cultural difference too. And I think Austin, has a little bit more of like a revenue-focused building culture than you have in, say, San Francisco, where it's like, how fast are you growing? As though growth was like the metric that really mattered. Here, we actually care about making money, and I think sort of like that type of aspect of projects too. So that's definitely a big difference as well.
And Joshua, turning to you, it's nice to be working with you these past few months on the investment committee. You also had some enterprise experience prior to blockchain, so I'm curious why you left that world and what did you see specifically? Because you went through the whole path that Kurt talked about before with the splits and the block size and all that. So do you want to maybe give us a little bit of detail on how you arrived here?
So I used to work for a top accounting firm in the U.S. doing our sector resold Microsoft ERP software. And I was the technical lead. So I would travel to clients on the implementation team, do full life cycle implementations. And one specialty that I ended up doing repeatedly for several clients was integrating credit cards with the Microsoft ERP. And I saw the pain points. Typically these guys are retailers, they have websites, point of sales, and the struggle with security, PCI compliance, all that type of stuff was, everyone's using it, so they got to do it, but it's very costly. Acquiring those licenses, the risk management side, and even the technical stuff, paying guys like me and our devs to do it, it's really tough. And when I got in with the price run up of Bitcoin in 2017, and that caught my eye, and then I read the white paper, and then since then I've been down the rabbit hole. So I went down, I guess, a 2-year rabbit hole, and what I found is I had stopped doing hobbies on the weekends, and I was researching and building stuff on the weekends from my job. And then, I thought, I love my job. I love the people I work with, not the clients so much. But I just quit in the 2018 and just went on my own just to build stuff and try to make some money.
And so, Andrea, I want to turn to you here. Everybody talks about how the promise of Bitcoin and the promise and the future, and it's always the future, the future, the future. Is there a company in your portfolio that's doing something today that you find a meaningful use of the blockchain? And it can be any industry, any of the industries that you want to highlight or talk about that you're excited about?
I'm involved in a company called Niftori. I love the speaker that we had a moment ago talking about the real value that NFTs will bring. I mean, they're cute, and so many people think it's fun to see something cute. But once you start to think so much more about how this could be an infrastructure piece is really cool. And so I have an investment in a company called Niftori, which is today on the Flow and Polygon blockchains, but it could be on anything really. And they help you mint, create all of the process to creating NFTs. So all you have to bring is your asset. And so that is happening today. It's, absolutely, it is absolutely happening, of course.
And how do you discover these? How do you discover these companies? Is there a process that you have, or you just find something that you like and you want to play with and use?
Well, I think I really like the name of this conference, Zach, Unbounded, because the way that you think about things. And one of the reasons that I so enjoy angel investing is it because it really unleashes my brain and allows me to think about new things. And in Austin, where we have such a vibrant, easy to engage in ecosystem, between the University of Texas, which is, how I met the Quai folks, between, Capital Factory, Techstars, whatever it is, any WeWork, any coffee shop, the amount of deal flow that any of us can have access to is just incredible. So and then after you express that you have interest in certain categories, certainly those things come to you. But Austin as an ecosystem is just an amazing place to be, right now, because there's so much happening.
And so, Josh, you're technical, much more technical than I and most. You and I had a conversation about this on an investment committee recently, and we were someone may have mentioned it earlier. We talked about the intersection of blockchain with AI and potentially identity and security. I think Kurt mentioned security as well. How do you see those three intersecting in the future? Do you see those as sort of separate silos, or like how does those three technologies work well together, or do they not?
No, I think they do. Seeing the rise of the Chat GPT, especially, to take a jab at the whole blockchain industry, right? To see them get millions of users while, no one's ever come close to that in 15 years of blockchain just tells you, when you make a good product, there's demand for it, right? And what's going on with that is great. There's some controversy with it, especially with the images and things like that. But what I'm noticing is people are tweaking these prompts and they're writing blog posts and trying to educate people how to use it in their business or their game or their art or whatever. And to me, it is a natural fit with blockchain, and identity is probably a necessary part, because if you think about it, well, I've tested it out. If I put in the same prompt, I get a different result, and it's ephemeral, right? But why shouldn't that just go on a blockchain? Because then it's a proof of existence. You need the identity to tie to it, so you know that that person did it, and they could prove it. So for that person writing the guide, he could sell that, right? But people could look at his history on the ledger and say, wow, he actually did all these prompts, and he signed it, cryptographically, so that he's not lying. He didn't just steal the work from somebody. So that's the sort of stuff I could see happening. And then, reputationally, that's happening with the NFTs, right? Yuga Labs is kind of a kindergarten example of it with the JPEG stuff, but that's a good example. They have a big reputation, and so when they just did the Ornos thing, they made lots of money, right? Just because of the name and the brand. So I see that continuing with the Chat GPT stuff, with the prompts especially, and the producing the content.
And we tend to see a lot of gaming as early adopters. I'm curious on the enterprise side. Where do you think the entrepreneurs are going to be coming from? Do you think it's data? Do you think it's cloud companies? Where do you think that brain power will come from the enterprise side?
In terms of
entrepreneurs that are building companies.
Enterprise, I don't actually think it'll come from enterprise. I think it'll come more from consumer side with games and artists and music, that sort of stuff. Because especially with, the TikTok and Instagram and Twitter scrolling, I heard someone make a comment to me about a few months ago, said, if you make a video longer than 60 seconds, you're wrecked. No one's going to watch it, right? Just that's the attention span. But, and everyone sees it. You get on an airplane, you're waiting for something. And Joe brought this up in his presentation earlier with Haste, the hyper casual games. To me, it's something like that. I remember Flappy Bird. It was just a wave. People played that silly game. If you imagine that hooked up to Haste, it would just go crazy, right? So I think it's going to be something like that just captures, that doesn't really communicate in words to the user, that just works, and then all the kind of Bitcoin stuff's working behind the scenes.
But if you think about like a Slack or something, it started like just users, and then it made its way into the enterprises. And so, that's how these things are going to sort of happen, I think.
I agree.
And Ted, from your perspective, are there any companies that you're excited about, or any sectors within blockchain itself, or any of your portfolio that you want to talk about?
Yeah, so we have a couple of things that we're really focused on. One is the intersection of blockchain and social impact. But I think the one sort of most interesting to talk about right now is bringing real world assets on chain. We're working on a project now that's doing essentially decentralized energy storage and arbitrage in Europe. So right now we're seeing, especially in Nordic countries, a lot of reliance on Russian oil, and that's becoming a political problem for them, and it's a sovereignty problem for them. And so one of our clients is essentially come up with a way of taking batteries that otherwise would have been used as trash, networking them together, buying energy from the grid at off-peak hours, then selling it back in at times that it's more expensive. And so it's just, it's like It's an actual practical application of blockchain technology that's having a real impact on people's lives. And I think there are a lot of other examples of like bringing real world assets on chain that I find particularly interesting. One of our clients right now is called watches.io, and they're essentially putting luxury watches on chain. So a lot of people have like these luxury watch or luxury goods collections, and they might have a multi-million-dollar collection that's sitting in a safe somewhere. So one is no one ever gets to see it or know like what they have in their collection, so you can create an NFT from it and sort of show off your profile. But more important than that is we're bringing liquidity to this market. So you can send in your watch, and NFT is created, and then you can borrow and lend against it. So you sort of have this DeFi meets luxury goods, type thing, and bring liquidity to things that have never had it before. And there's huge swaths like of goods that have no liquidity. I mean, if you look at the fine art world, most of this stuff sits like in Swiss freehold ports and never gets looked at by anyone. And you have these long-term appreciating assets that people don't get to appreciate, but you have no liquidity in. When you bring liquidity to an asset class, you're inherently increasing the value of it. When you look at like minority interest in private companies, you have these discounts applied for lack of marketability. You have the same thing essentially happening across all these goods. So bringing these real world assets on chain and allowing for like DeFi lending, borrowing against them, I think is going to be a revolution in unlocking new value from these assets, but just sort of fundamentally changing the way that we think about these things and like the frequency that they're being traded with. I could talk about 100 other projects, but that's a couple that I think are interesting.
I'm curious from your lawyer background as an attorney. We've seen a big crackdown on exchanges. I mean, the government's coming, right? The U.S. government's finally woken up. Are you worried about either the payment side of it or the security aspect, or with the psychedelics, for example? Are you worried about any sort of regulatory impact on your companies?
So like, we'll start with the blockchain and then the psychedelics. In 2017, I was the guy screaming from the rooftops, like, all these ICOs are securities. These are all securities. And, like, no one wanted to listen because everyone was making money, right? So I feel like we're just kind of now catching up to that. I think because of the spectacular failure of FTX and BlockFi and Celsius and all these things, we're going to see a much stronger swing of the pendulum towards regulation than we may have seen otherwise. And I think that's not great for the industry overall. At the same time, companies need a clear regulatory environment in which to operate if they're going to be successful, right? The uncertainty is a huge problem. And so bringing certainty and clarity to the space, I think, is actually a good thing long term. It's going to be a little bit more painful in the short term than I think we might have liked and the way that it could have gone. But ultimately, it's something that we need. Additionally, we have to acknowledge that in this space, there is a way to participate that is totally outside of the bounds of law, and some people are going to do that anyways. A lot of DeFi is going to operate outside the bounds of traditional like national jurisdictions and things. And so, if you're the true sort of believer and zealot for this tech, like you have the option to play in that side as well. On the psychedelic side, most of my work is in the legal regulated side of things. We just took a company public on the NASDAQ a few weeks ago called Lucy Scientific Discovery. That's an actual manufacturer of psychedelic medicines, and we sell to universities and research institutions and things like that. So, that's a very heavily regulated side of things. A lot of the work that we're doing that would not be allowed in the US is done, offshore, and there's countries that are a lot more open to these things than the US is, which I think is a shame because, we're going to be left behind on a lot of these things, or it'll take a lot longer to come to the US. And I think that's a shame, right? That's sort of like a core thread that we can draw between both the blockchain and the psychedelic side is these things are going to happen anyways, and there are always going to be, governments that are more prescient and more forward thinking about these things. And ultimately amazing things will be created in those places and not here, if that's the case. So I think overall, good thing to have regulation in the space. Maybe it's going to go a little bit of a different way than we would have liked it. And then the psychedelic side, again, you can play in the legal regulatory side here, or you can play in the offshore space, or you can, sort of just wait for there to be enough movement, on the regulatory side in the US to be doing it here. Personally, I've been an advocate for, these tools of healing for a really long time. Back in 2017, we started this organization called Crypto Psychedelic and did some events around it talking about the kind of overlap between the space that I think there's a lot of. And, a lot of our friends and mentors were like, are you guys sure that you want to do this? you're going to lose business over this. You're not going to get invited to talk on stages and things. And, at the time, we just really felt a responsibility to be talking about these things, which had been so helpful for us. And now in hindsight, like, the reason that we're the guys helping take companies public on the NASDAQ is because we were the ones who were public about it, years and years ago, before, Michael Pollan was talking about it on, the evening shows, before John Oliver and Stephen Colbert were talking about these things. Like, we were taking arrows on the front lines of that movement, right? You see the exact same thing in the blockchain space, like, when I was coming from being an SEC attorney to then like telling everyone about Bitcoin, that freaked out a lot of people who, were my colleagues. And at the same time, like, the reasons that we have the opportunities today is because we took that risk early on. So you have to decide for yourself sort of like what your risk tolerance is. But if you're going to be early, then, there's going to be a little bit of pain along the way.
You've given us some good ideas for our next investment committee, by the way. So Andrea, we've talked about the past, we talked about where we are today. Let's look forward. Let's look ahead. Where do you think the industry will be in 5-7 years from today? Like, what would you hope it to be, and what kind of vision do you have for blockchain generally? But you can be specific if you'd like.
I think we're at, a really, really painful time. It's a really painful time after FTX and all of that stuff. But it's not that different than when I left. So when I left New York in 1999, I had done the IPOs for the .com craze, and it was just madness. And we were flying around on private jets, getting $1 billion raised in a day. Just like crazy things that only sound like movies. And that's sort of what happened again last year. But we always, the core technologies and the things that matter really come out of all of this, and the mess goes away, and the proper regulations come, and there'll be proper regulations for generative AI. There'll be proper regulations for this. And then we have to rebuild some of the credibility of the industry, which is the part that makes me sad, because it's so people feel like they were fleeced. And when I was going to Eat Denver last week, where they were like, "Oh, you're going to go hang out with Tom Brady?" And I'm just like, okay, that's like, it was just so silly. It was so silly last year. And so we have a lot of that to clean up. But then after the cleanup, the ability to transact quickly, securely, and decentralized, and the ability for people to have privacy, all of these things eventually come together. And I love the fact that you're doing social good, because last year I learned the term degen to regen. And I love that expression, like really solving the biggest of the world's problems with interesting technologies. And so we will get there, and this we just had this inevitable flush out.
And Joshua, I want you to sort of address the technical entrepreneurs in the room. So now you've had a chance to sort of sit on both sides of the fence. You've sort of seen the sausage being made and the discussions on making investments. And you've also done a lot of entrepreneurial activity yourself in terms of building. Do you have any advice to any technical founders out there that may be listening on how to build or develop or approach their future?
Yeah, what I believe is that, especially just watching some of the stuff over the last few months, is that to me, demand is king, right? It starts with the customer. And, there's a lot of narratives, especially with how Web 2 or whatever they call it has kind of consolidated, right? Standard now is you don't build a web app anymore. You go through the Google Play, the app stores, you play with their controls. There's some languages that make that easy where you can deploy to both, but you're still at the whims of them, and they're taking their 30% if you start making some money, which is, it's kind of absurd in my opinion. But if you launch a web app, just a standard web page, you can do that very, very, very quickly. We're talking hours or days, right? But what's told to people in traditional Web 2 is that, well, no, you can't do that because people want to download an app. Okay, that's true. But then I look at, for example, what's going on with this ordinal stuff. They don't have any web apps. It's a domain. You type in the website and you go, and people are just trading JPEGs and making money. So for me, I just don't want to hear it, right? Because it's like, what I'm seeing is just not matching up. There was another game developer who reached out to me. He was on the soapbox saying that, no one's going to play these games unless they're in the Google Play Store. Well, Joe can talk about this. He made tons of money from his simple little tap game, and it was a domain. So that's what I feel, to just go, because the system, in my opinion, is designed from what Satoshi launched. You made 50 Bitcoins if you mined a block in 2009. Today it's 6.25. So the system to me is designed to iterate. I'm not saying release junk, but I'm saying continue to iterate and deliver product and make money.
Interesting. And as part of your portfolio going forward, what's the breakdown in terms of sectors? Like how much is blockchain a part of it? And is it going to be more or less, do you think, going forward?
Yeah, we're about 60% blockchain and then 20% each, like psychedelic medicine. And then I do a lot of work with like genetics, CRISPR, longevity, biohacking kind of stuff.
You do public only, or I mean early stage, but like CRISPR is a public company. What you mean the next gen of those types of companies?
So like CRISPR is a technology platform. There's different iterations of it, and it's being licensed for different purposes. What I'm working on specifically is gene editing your brain to right now like cure disease, but eventually working on something that I'm calling designer consciousness. So you have genes that are associated with mindfulness, optimism, conscientiousness. So we'll just give you a little choose your own brain adventure, and you can decide how you want to perceive the world.
That's cool. That's really cool. Do you think it's possible to put your DNA genetic structure on chain? Is that
sure? Yeah. Yeah.
That's cool. That's really interesting. All right, I want to play quick word association. I'm going to throw out a word, and you guys just throw out the first one that comes to your mind. Sam Bankman-Fried.
Sad.
Sad.
Scam, bankrupt, fraud.
It's 3 words. Strong.
I hate when fellow Jews get arrested for financial crimes.
Speaking of, being in the dark, Aaron Rodgers.
Legend.
Cool eyebrow.
Only what? You mentioned Tom Brady, so I thought maybe you were a football fan, but maybe not. Okay.
Like nothing. That's sort of sad for me. That's like how not connected I am to real culture.
Well, speaking of real culture, Miami.
Gold chain.
Beach.
All fake everything.
I could keep going, but I think I'm going to get some people in trouble. So I'd like to take the opportunity to open up for questions. So if any panelists have questions for each other, or if anybody has any specific questions, just address the individual, Joshua, Ted, or Andrea, or myself, before you speak. So go ahead. We got a question over here in the white.
All right. So based on what you guys mentioned as like your area of investments, I've seen a couple articles making correlations between the crypto industry in terms of like regulatorily what's going on and the psychedelics industry. And so personally, one of the companies I have is a marketing firm, and we've been thinking about this a lot. It's technically speaking, I do see spillover here because it's like we've dealt so long with trying to understand regulation in such a murky area. Same thing's happening in psychedelics, but I'm actually interested in seeing if you see a larger crossover there between that emerging industry and potentially like in what way could these industries working together or merging some way be interesting to you?
Yeah, I think that's for you, Ted, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I said Mike. I meant Ted. Yeah. Sorry.
So there's a lot of philosophical underpinnings like between these movements, right? So I think that psychedelics allow you to fundamentally see the world in a different way, and it allows you to sort of question assumptions that we take for granted about the world and nature of reality and like the realness of what we experience. I think similarly, being involved in the blockchain movement, like the concept of money is pretty ingrained, and people generally have a sense of like what it is. And most people think like the US dollar is this really like stable, real kind of thing, And so to be involved in this movement, I think you similarly have to, throw out old ways of thinking about the world and adopt new things. That's one of the sort of underpinnings. There's also like a sort of visual resemblance like between these things. I mean, a decentralized blockchain looks a lot like a mycelium network of psychedelic mushrooms, right? These, existed as like informal underground trust networks for a really long time, like early in both of these movements. So there's definitely a lot of overlap between them, I think, just in that sense. A lot of the early work that we were doing, and part of why we created Crypto Psychedelic as an event series was, it was sort of like a time period in 2017 where people were making a ton of money. We knew a lot of those folks, had probably done psychedelics, and we wanted to do research, or we wanted to do fundraising for research into psychedelic medicine. And organizations like MAPS that now is doing FDA clinical trials and they're in phase 3, like they could not take donations via credit card. I mean, this was real research, right? And so, we had this idea of like, how do we help them raise money? And, doing it via crypto was an option that worked. Now we're seeing the rise of like DeSci and like funding scientific research outside of the traditional ways of doing it. That's only made possible because, of crypto and like the DAO movements and things like that. So, there's a ton of like historical overlap. There's a ton of philosophical overlap between them. And I think there's certainly a lot of commonality.
It seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, is the psychedelics starting to get accepted into mainstream faster?
Yeah.
Because it seemed like my daughter was writing about a term paper about psychedelics and PTSD, like as a term paper the other day. And so, like, when I think veteran communities and stuff, it seems like it's getting accepted faster.
The pace of like positive change is continually quickening in the world, right? Like when we look at these large shifts that have happened historically, like, like the Christian Reformation played out over like hundreds of years. And now we see like in the Arab Spring, like these things being really compressed, similarly, good ideas whose times have come are shared so much more quickly than they've ever been before. It's so much harder to censor good ideas than it's ever been before. It's so much easier to find access to any information in the world that you might possibly want for like self-experimentation with these things. And, now I think we just have this like real mental health care crisis in this country, and we owe ourselves the best tools possible for dealing with these. And so a lot of the movement, I think, has been driven like by work in veterans communities and people who've experienced trauma and things like that. And, they work better than the traditional pharmaceuticals that we have. And similarly, there's all-time low trust in traditional pharmaceuticals and healthcare and things like that. So you definitely have a big confluence of factors that are driving like a quickening of the pace of adoption for sure.
How do you deal with so I did an investment in a payment provider for marijuana dispensaries, and they had to shift their model because although it was legal in the state of California, it was illegal federally, and they were very afraid of losing banking license. How are psychedelics treated from a financial perspective in intrastate, cross-state?
Well, so like, similar to what you were seeing in cannabis, like if you're doing, like gray market psychedelic work, then, you're not going to have like the traditional banking support. Similarly, if you're in a state where it is actually legal to be providing these things, just like it's legal to sell pot in California, like you're also not going to have access to federal banking, right? So I think it's the exact same way. I mean, realistically, we're going to need federal legalization in order to actually have, like real payment rails in both of these things. And also, we're seeing a lot of alternative ways of transacting with each other outside the traditional banking system that didn't exist before. And there are a lot of like online direct-to-consumer companies selling psilocybin mushrooms right now that you can go find online and pay in Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say that Congress could definitely benefit from some psilocybin. And are there any other questions out there? Over here.
Thank you. Vernon Lee again, the Marathon Fund out of DC. Air Force veteran, former PricewaterhouseCoopers. But my question, thanks for all of your comments and feedback. I like all of the different perspectives. Could you just talk about the one thing that post South by, because you're going to be focused on first? Is it a founder? Is it a specific project? Could you just pick the one thing that, wow, next week I'm really looking forward to getting back to that one thing. And again, whether it's a project, a founder, or whatever that next.
Why don't we just start and just quick answers, everyone?
This might not be the most satisfying answer given the context, but we're closing today on buying a Major League Pickleball team, the Texas Rangers. So I'm really excited about that.
That's cool.
Just you got to attract people, man. Like, be better. You won't have to worry about it.
Joshua?
Yeah, I actually want to get back to building myself. Life has been disruptive for a bit because I've been moving, but I want to start coding games And I feel like this chat GPT AI stuff can really bootstrap that and make things easier, in terms of hiring an artist, just get something working.
And I, have quite a lot of portfolio companies, and the world is throwing curveballs to everyone right now. And so it's just really important to be there for everyone to help them solve problems. Because, like this SVB news today, there's just crazy, crazy stuff. So we just all need to be there to support our friends and be smart about, all the ways that we can go forward.
Yeah, and I'll answer that. I spent my airplane ride reading all of the annual letters Jeff Bezos wrote from 1997 to today. That's the kind of guy I am. But there's a message that he does in there, and if you've not read them, they're much better than Warren Buffett's, especially if you're a technology person. And to see the growth of Amazon over these decades is astounding. So I was old enough to be around during the first .com collapse, and Amazon lost 90% of its market share essentially overnight. But the one key theme that Bezos always talks about is relentless customer. He's always focused on the customer, but he repeats his 1997 letter in every subsequent year, and he calls it day one. And what he meant by that is day one was day one of the internet, and this was back when we had dial-up modems. They only shipped books. So what he kept saying to people is, we're in day one, and we'll always be in day one, because day one is growth, relentless pursuit of excellence. And someone asked him what day two was, and he said, day two is decline. Day two is competition eats you and you go out of business. So I just, one of the things I like to say is that it's day one. So we have an entrepreneur in our portfolio that had a pretty big milestone, and the first thing I said over Slack was day one. So what that means is, you need to focus on what you can do today, because all the effort that you put in today and all the hard work that everybody, I know not everyone here is a BSVer, but personally I've seen this ecosystem for the last 4 years. We've hit a lot of brick walls, and it's still day one. And I'm finally starting to see some of the growth and the success, not just of our portfolio companies, but some real business and some real new innovative business models that have never been done before. So regardless of the chain, it's very exciting for me. And so I'm perpetually in day one. So that's my focus on that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. When we talk about money and when we talk about value, I think one thing that's really important is that it is dependable. And so my question is actually for Josh, and it's relating to Bitcoin as a commodity, and the importance of for example, gold's a commodity, but it has atomic properties that cannot be changed by someone rewriting a line of code. So can you please talk about the importance of a stable protocol when it comes to the determination of a digital asset as a commodity?
Yeah, the way I look at something, say Bitcoin, for example, is the innovation was kind of stated by Satoshi on the first page is, commerce on the internet, lowering the payment cost. And, a lot of folks just don't get Bitcoin, and I get it because, you look at it, they say, what is it backed by? Fiat, by the government. Gold is always going to have its properties immutable, to your point. And to me, that is the value proposition, is that it drops that payment cost on the internet. It removes the floor completely. And I think that's why it's so hard for people to think, what would someone do for a penny on the internet? We have no idea because we've never been able to do it. So and a lot of folks say it can't be done, right? I'm sure, like you were saying, Mike, with Bezos, I'm sure a lot of folks are saying, hey, you're done after you're 90%. And we hit those walls and people say, oh, these business models will never work. Well, how do we know, right? We just got this tech and we're just testing it out. So to me, that is the value of it. And I know that's hard to grasp because we've just never seen it. Same thing, I always go back to the, I think it was Letterman interviewing Bill Gates in '94. And he was explaining emails like, why can't I just fax? And I always make fun of it. I said, well, I can just send a Raven, And that's how I look at it. So that's to me the commodity value of the Bitcoin.
Cool. Well, on that note, thank you so much, everyone. Let's give a hand for the panel here, Ted, Joshua, Andrea, and Mike.